Hello, everyone, and welcome to the 12th Canadian Science Policy Conference, or CSPC 2020. Bonjour, mesdames et messieurs, et bienvenue à la 12e conférence sur la politique scientifique canadienne. Once again, another interview series for the conference, and this time we are pleased to have with us Dr. Eric Meslin, President of Council of Canadian Academies. Welcome to the CSPC 2020, Eric.
Thanks very much, Mehrdad. Delighted to be here.
Although this is virtually, and since your appointment to the job, I believe in 2016, if I'm not mistaken, you have been usual participant, speaker, panelist, commentator at the CSPC, and you received very high ranking with respect to your moderation skills, not to talk about the content. That's always fabulous.
Thank you.
Okay, first I want to congratulate you and the CCA team for the 15th anniversary. That's just great. And can you tell us how the organization and its vision have evolved over these past 15 years to adapt the changing and evolving landscape of science policy?
I think one of the interesting things about organizations like the CCA, organizations that carry out research to inform policy in many different forms, is kind of the irony of they do the same thing over and over and over again, hopefully because it is felt to be useful, but also try to innovate where necessary. As you said in the intro, I have come to CCA. I've been here about 5 years. February of the coming year, 2021, will be 5 years. So I can look back, like many can, on the first 10 years before I arrived, and maybe on the last 5 years, and draw two probably straightforward conclusions. One is the vision has been rock solid from the very start and has probably continued, and that is to provide independent, objective assessments of the state of knowledge on any number of questions that have been asked of us by mostly the federal government of Canada. But on occasion there have been others. And it's that key sort of secret sauce of looking at the evidence in an objective, dispassionate way, bringing in the best minds in the country and oftentimes from around the world to really dig into and synthesize what is known and what isn't known. I think that has been consistent throughout our existence. We haven't strayed from that path to take on new areas of activity or new models or new functions. At the same time, we have innovated, I hope, a little bit over the last few years. One is that the way that we have received questions has become a bit more efficient from the federal government. This allows us to be much more active, to prepare, to work on priority-based topics, not just you might call them curiosity topics. Every question is interesting, but with a small organization, there's only so much you can do it at one time. But I think the idea of what we've done and what we will continue to do moving forward is to take on topics of real importance to Canada and Canadians, and to do so as part of a broad ecosystem of which the CSPC is an important part, and continue to make a difference that way.
Thank you. So, building on that history, Eric, what are some of the biggest achievements looking back, and what are you most excited about moving forward?
I can think of in a sense, a boring achievement, and that is survival. We often overlook the fact that organizations like ours that are not established in legislation or have a permanent, sustainable life plan to survive through several administrations. We began in 2005, and here we are approaching 2021. It's not insignificant. It's easy at a time of fiscal restraint to look to organizations that may not be building physical infrastructure or training the next generation of scientists, but who are here to provide information that can be used by others, to look at them as if they are less useful. So I'm grateful for all of the governments of Canada that have supported CCA over the years. So that's maybe a minor achievement. But more substantively, I can think of a couple of assessments very recently that I think began to show what our true potential is. The one that many people might be aware of is the large assessment on medical assistance in dying. It was important not only because of its content, which I think stands on its own. It's 850 odd pages of work that was done over 2 years with 43 panel members and divided into 3 working groups and chaired by a former Supreme Court justice. But because it was a question that came to us directly from the government through an act of parliament. So when the medical assistance in dying or MAID legislation was introduced, many people may know that there was a provision in the legislation itself that identified 3 topics that Parliament just could not come to agreement on. One was on MAID for children, another one was on MAID for those with mental disorders, and a third one on advanced care planning, advanced directives. So it was a commentary on Parliament's inability to come to agreement that they parked these 3 topics in legislation and said, we would like there to be an assessment of these done in the future. And they actually put a date by which it had to be done. And CCA met the deadline, submitted the work to the Minister of Justice and the Minister of Health, the 2 entities that sponsored the work. And it was tabled in Parliament on the day that it was required to be. And I think that was an important achievement for CCA to respond at a particular moment for a particular reason with a specific deadline and a budget. And for those who are watching this interview and who work in the area of science, advice, and policy and evidence, sometimes the most important thing is getting the work done when it is requested, when it is most urgently needed. Having it completed, after Parliament has risen or after the debate is over is less important. So I was very proud of our staff, of the sponsors who guided us, and of the panel members who completed the work.
Very good. And I also, I must mention the reports that you have produced, CCA produced in 2012 or 13 about the status of science in Canada. Yes. And the one in 2018 was, they are an excellent assessment of the status of science and innovation in Canada. It's the best resource and absolutely evidence-based and peer-reviewed with the best people in the country. They have been drafted to represent the huge amount of data. I often use some of those slides and data in my presentations, but I think it's a best reference for the status of science and innovation in Canada.
Thank you for saying that, Mehrdad. It's another interesting way of looking at the capacity of organizations like ours, and I say like ours because there are many groups around the country and around the world who carry out similar, maybe not identical activity, looking at a body of knowledge. In the case of the S&T reports, the R&D reports, and there were a large handful of them, 5 in total when you go all the way back to 2006, it tells 2 stories. One of those stories is how Canada is faring relative to its peers. And that's a good benchmarking model. How are we and where do we stand? I think that's very useful, as you said. But the other perhaps is a bit more reflective and personal, not for me personal, but personal for Canada, to have a good hard look in the mirror and see how we're doing in these areas and where we want to go. In fact, some have said that the CCA reports have been very useful because they said the same thing time and again about our ability to be innovative, or what is holding us back, or where do we wish to stand. And this is where I think CCA's other capacity to not drift too far into normative, prescriptive recommendations for changing behavior or changing policy, but to put squarely in front of those who need the information what the state of knowledge is. And there are lots of folks who can give specific advice, but we also like to think that there is advice maybe just below the surface. If you read carefully, you can find things that the panels think make sense, even if it is not so obvious as a recommended piece of legislation or a funding bucket. But I think you're quite right about the S&T reports as a collection of topics.
Okay, so to celebrate your twin milestones, I guess 15 years and 50 reports. Am I right about that? 50 reports?
Well, when we wrote the press release, we were at about 52 or 3, and we're closing in on 60. It's one of those moments. It's almost like the genome being sequenced when we just decided the date that we're going to declare the genome sequenced, even though we passed the number already.
Right.
But yes, it's been over 50.
Okay, over 50 reports. So I know that CCA invited several prominent Canadians and thought leaders, if you will, to identify some of the big questions facing Canada. I want to ask you, what have been some of the common and recurring themes among these answers or questions?
Well, first of all, I think I appreciate you paying attention to it. Our Director of Communications, Heather Ennis, and her team worked very hard to come up with an innovative way of celebrating in a typically Canadian way. We didn't have a news conference. We noted that we had been around for 15 years and observed that we had completed 50 or so assessments. And in the midst of all this, there was a pandemic. The project itself began before that, but you're right. We asked a number of people to identify topics and questions that were intriguing and challenging that they thought would be worth considering. Not so much as questions for CCA to answer as if it were a formal referral, but more of what's on the mind. And I can think of maybe 3 broad categories, which I find reassuring, irrespective of who the people were. One was about the climate and the environment. I think Canada is positioning itself very well to be asking of itself, what can it do and what should it do in the area of climate change, and not just greenhouse gas emissions, but in all aspects, from building to health and the like. So there was a recurring theme about the importance of addressing this broad bucket of issues involving the climate. The second is, it wasn't surprising that since many of the experts and leaders and visionary thinkers were giving their answers during COVID-19, that theme came up. And I would say that it came up in a couple of ways. One was the immediate urgency of how are we going to deal with these issues? There are questions about vaccine allocation. There are questions about evolution of the science and understanding more. And then, of course, the second version is, how will we prepare for the next one? Because there will be a next one and another and another. And I rather like the fact that this distinguished group were able to capture these different aspects of, in this case, the COVID-19 pandemic, but pandemics and difficult, challenging nationwide emergencies. I thought that was quite important. And then I think the third bucket was a cluster, as I would say, it wouldn't come under one named theme, but really related to who we were as Canada and Canadians in the world. And this included issues around Indigenous and local knowledge. It included questions about what we think the value of science is and how well informed we are. So what I liked about, and these were 15 or 20, we could have had 50 answers. We couldn't include them all. There were more in the office, so to speak. But I think it showed both the visionary thinking of the individuals themselves, and all we were able to do was tee up what do you think the questions might be, and they went off without any difficulty. And I think that bodes well for how the leaders in Canada, young and old, are thinking about the role of good questions and good answers for Canada.
Okay. One of CCA's latest projects concerned high throughput networks for rural and remote communities in this day and age. Of course, it's with so much remote work, communication and interconnectedness are crucial. What are the challenges involved with this project?
Well, the project is just getting started. We announced it recently, as you know, and sort of there's two kinds of answers to the question. The first is there are the normal challenges of any CCA assessment, convening the right people in the right way. I'm absolutely delighted that Karen Brooks, the former president of UConn University, is chairing this panel. I think that's important for a number of reasons. So the literal how does CCA do its work under pandemic conditions is a non-trivial matter. As you know, with your shop and others who are watching, you can't simply carry on business as usual under these conditions. And CCA's lifeblood are the expert panels who meet often and almost exclusively face-to-face for all the reasons that we know. By collaborating with people, it's best to sit across the table from them. Some of the best conversations occur over the coffee break or over a meal. It's a lot more difficult to have the nuanced discussion and kind of back and forth expert judgment collaboration disputes over the two-dimensional structure of a Zoom call. So there are those challenges. I think the second type of challenge, which is probably not surprising, and the panel hasn't met, so we'll find out what they think, is in every CCA topic, and this one is no different, there are multiple angles to take. The technology angle, the geographic angle, the impact on rural and remote communities wherever they may be, in the north or even in the nearer, so to speak, to the main border with the US. So these kinds of issues around the capacity of Canada to respond to this problem, I think are, as I say, not unique to this topic, but because it's partly a technology topic and easily understood by many people. You know, they may be watching this very program and having difficulty logging on. They may have difficulty with getting access to the very material, the very tools that they need to engage in society. So among the many challenges with every CCA report is wanting to get it done on time, to be responsive to the sponsor's request. We call that the kind of scoping issue, not so broad as to boil the ocean, not so narrow that the answer is 7. I mean, we give answers to the questions that are meant to be informative and useful. So I see this as one of CCA's many assessments that cover more than one silo, right? It's not limited to those people who can't get fast internet. This is a much more complex topic than that.
Okay, so I want to ask specifically a question about pandemic. It's hard to avoid it. On that, I want to know what are some of the other particularly complex issues concerning COVID-19 that CCA has encountered and how they have been addressed.
Sure. Again, there's the housekeeping issue of how our organization functions under COVID-19. And like many organizations, we've been trying our best to recognize what the challenges are. Since March, like probably everybody else in Canada, our entire staff have gone home, and they, as I like to call it, they are working while they're at home. I think the phrase working from home is doesn't really cover it. As anyone who has children or is looking after others would know, this is a very new arrangement, and trying to figure it out from a day-to-day basis, including schools, including the technology, is, as I said earlier, it's non-trivial. It's a significant issue to keep an organization of about 25 staff operating, motivated. I hope we are. They work so very hard, and yet these are challenging times. We've been taking the view that we should be thinking 3 or 4 months ahead of where we are now before any decisions are made about anything resembling returning. And the same issue arises with respect to our panels, who are all meeting virtually, as I said before. to our scientific advisory committee, to our board of directors. Everything is done through a screen and a camera. And those are challenges, let alone the challenges that arise. Fortunately, they have not befallen CCA yet, where someone might be sick or ill, and we have to manage with that. We do have situations, as everyone does, where there are questions about testing and the like. So we're an organization that is built on evidence. So I hope we are doing the best that we can with the advice that we receive from public health officials. As for the COVID-19 topic, of course, CCA doesn't just jump in and carry out assessments on topics that it's not requested, but we're monitoring this quite a lot now. We did take the view, and I'm more happy than ever that we made this view, that early on in the pandemic, we did not sort of try to ask to be asked to carry out an assessment. I think in retrospect, that was the right and wise decision. The technology, the science was moving very quickly. It would have been quite hard for CCA to engage early on any kind of CCA assessment on this. Now we've come 8 months in. There's probably an opportunity for us to be helpful if requested. As we know, the government is coming out from the first wave, and we'll be planning for the future. So there'll be ample questions for everyone in the science, policy, and advice ecosystem to be asked and to answer. I think it's plenty of questions to be addressed.
Okay. Last question, and that's about CSPC. Over the last decade, many of the CCA reports have been discussed, presented at the CSPC conferences, and you yourself, as I mentioned at the beginning, have been a constant panelist at the CSPC panel sessions. And now, after the first decade, we have evolved. We have other operations, workshops, and Science Meets Parliament magazine and others. I would ask you, what do you think of the value and contribution of the CSPC with its conference and other operations as a convener, capacity builder for the SDI community in Canada?
Well, for the record, you didn't pay me for this answer, but I have to say that I can't think of an organization better positioned in Canada to do the work that CSPC does.
Thank you.
And I say that because there really isn't this kind of niche that people understand as well as CSPC does. Some of that goes obviously to you, Mehrdad, and your team. Some of it also goes to the receptor capacity of the broader community, who have many conferences that they could go to on any given day or week. But I have been almost stunned by the willingness of, certainly in past years, not this year clearly, of groups, whether they be governmental, non-governmental, philanthropic, or policy, who have made the choice that if they can go to one meeting this year to learn not only about what's going on in Canada, but to meet people who have a broad view about science and science policy, they pick CSPC. Now that's you probably have this data in your hand, but just anecdotally, I know that this is the case. But let me say why. So it's not just you built it and people will come. That's a true statement, but we also know that you're only as good as your last conference. People can decide that was fine, but I don't need to go next year. I said earlier that I've been at CCA for 5 years. The first time I was at CSPC, I wasn't actually there. My announcement, the appointment announcement, was made by my predecessor. So I was sort of a ghost at a CSPC meeting in 2015, November of 2015. And when I came to my first one the following year, it was big enough to be friendly, big enough to be useful, and small enough to be friendly. And then with good judgment led by you, Mehrdad, it evolved to be more than just sort of a quaint Ottawa-based meeting with a bunch of people. It became a going concern. And I don't have to recite to you or the folks on the call the rock star list of keynote speakers, whether it's a governor general or whether it's someone from the veterans, from Perimeter. There may be, I can't think of people who haven't been there that are making key decisions in Canada. So that part of decision, choice, and preference is key. The last thing I will say, and we all know this from going to meetings, I personally can assure you that those meetings have been useful for not just discussion of CCA reports, but engagement with people who are using them. 2 years ago, Marc Lepage was on a panel talking about the CCA report on science culture. I wasn't on the panel. It was one of the panel members talking about the report that gave rise to a fabulous conversation about the state of science culture in Canada. What's the public knowledge? Should we do another report? Who's doing what? It was the exact stimulus. The same thing with the subnational science policy, a panel that Jeff Kinder was on. I could go on and on. There have been many occasions when, from the CCA's perspective, thank you very much, we were given an opportunity not to announce ourselves, but to use the work as an entry point for having further conversations, which is what I think CSPC does so well. So we thank you for that too.
Thank you very much, Eric, for this fabulous statement, and I appreciate that. And we have been so pleased and proud to be able to host the discussions and engagement of the community with the topics, valuable topics that CCA reports presented. And so this is certainly, it's a work together as a community, and each of us do something. Your work is more important than ours, but each of us try to do something. But thank you for that statement, and I appreciate that. With that, this is the end of the interview, and I hope you enjoy the conference this year, despite the fact that it's virtual. The content is very good. I hope the interactivity is, at least is acceptable for the participants, and look forward to have you in our future events, and best of luck with the celebration of the anniversary.
Thank you very much, Mehrdad. A pleasure to be here. Congratulations to CSPC.
Thank you. Merci.